All right, what's up everyone? Today I'm here at the FAU Gruber AI Sandbox, the same place that we held Polymath Medical with said Ruben Gruber, Alon Barinholtz, William Hahn, who's somewhere on the premises. And in typical Sandbox NPCR fashion, we're going to be talking about some very unorthodox, interdisciplinary, weird experimental ideas. Now, if you've joined many of my Polymath salons in the past, in person or online, I've talked about this bigger picture that I'm working towards about how language can induce altered states of consciousness. So we're going to be diving into that a bit today. It's actually going to be sort of a rehearsal of what I did on the Substack post, which got some good traction. And then also, because of the type of crowd that we have today, I'm very happy that I'll be able to interact with people. So I can interact with you and you and you, and we can kind of have more of a personal discussion on these things. And all right, TLDR. Learning unconventional languages, like a language made of smells, can probably modify your sense of self, interpretation of memories, and perception in general. Basically, you're using language to induce an altered state of consciousness. Now, my question to everyone here is, let's say, you haven't taken some kind of crazy psychedelic and you haven't tripped balls, or you haven't, done some extremely advanced, intensive meditative experience. Are there other ways that you guys have altered your states of perception, cognition, consciousness without using those things, if anyone has any takers here?
Yeah, Gregorian chant as an example.
Right. What type of state did that kind of induce in you?
Well, what we did was we used those as a basis for neurological programming for Parkinson's symptom relief. We used Hildegard von Bingen Gregorian chant.
And how did you find out about this?
Well, one of the things that we discovered was plain chant reaches into sort of like the mother's touch. And that was her reference 900 years ago. So she said, the idea of composing this, she was probably the first known Western female composer. And we're doing a program with her. And that cued me into this because we also look at olfactory stimulation responses and what it does to the perception field. Now,
do you feel that, something that I've also spoken a bit about in these salons and stuff is that, we talk about hypnosis. So hypnosis kind of has a very eclectic persona in the zeitgeist, but there's actually good evidence, like it's a real thing. And by the way, apparently this is also what a lot of top athletes will try to get into these types of states, where they can, almost like they're stepping into the character. Like when Mike Tyson is stepping into the ring, he's stepping into the character Mike Tyson so he could destroy everyone, right? I think Michael Jordan also has spoken about this stuff. But these aren't new ideas. These are definitely not new ideas. And I think what happens is you have these kinds of invariances of ideas and concepts throughout history, and each generation they get repackaged. So this generation's repackaging, right? But yes, we're going to be talking about language to induce altered states of consciousness. So what are the unknown unknowns of reality? What are the blind spots we don't even know that we have, right? Ironically, the way we think about things like blind spots and concepts itself, right, in general are probably because of the types of observers and minds that we are, right? So we think of math in the way that we do because of the kinds of observers that we are. We think of physics in the way that we do because of the kinds of observers, minds, and perceivers that we are, right? Same thing for music and language itself and life itself and all these things. And that's because of the capacities and qualities as a perceiver with the mind that we have, right? So before I move on to the next slide, I kind of want to ask everyone, what is perception to you? If we want to go throughout the room, just quickly in a couple words, what is perception to you?
It's how we experience things through our inputs, through our sensory capabilities.
Right. Is it limited by your sensory capabilities?
To a large degree, it's certainly limited by our sensory capabilities and our processing capabilities.
Right. Because you could say, there's sort of the limitations of what's coming in through, say, your eyes or whatever, but if you ask most scientists, do you see with your eyes or with your brain? You technically actually see with your brain, right? So that's why if you're really sleepy, you take some substance or whatever, like, you could think that chair is a dog. You'd be fully convinced and it's going to look like a dog. And you could see these patterns and things that are supposed to, not supposedly there. And, again, you could be drunk, you could be high, inebriated, sleepy, whatever, and you can have these types of effects. And there's nothing about your eyes that have changed as far as we know. It's actually the brain. And we know through also like very, again, advanced intensive meditative practices like kasina meditation and stuff like that, as people can train themselves to make these kinds of very, very vivid, almost hallucinations and visualizations in a sober state. They have control over it, they're fully functional, they excel at their jobs, but they also have this very strange ability. Michael, what's perception to you?
It's a combination of getting sensory data from our, senses and the conversion of that into sensory qualia.
Okay. Randy?
Yeah, what we're looking at is a sensorium establishing meaning.
Sensorium?
Yep, your sensorium. What you described as your sensorium. So what's happening is we're starting to look at biofield stimulation information. So in other words, I don't see someone behind me, yet the hair on the back of my neck starts to stand out. What is that perception? Well, what we're discovering is that we have ASMR responses that are teamed in with some of the survival elements.
Oh, the ASMR thing, that's, all right, maybe a topic for another time, because we'll get carried away.
We discovered, for example, the girls in the sorority swimming in the Connecticut River, in the ice, doing the ice.
Yeah.
One of the things that they discovered was the actual startle experience and then being removed from it, and that startle reflex response activated the whole sensorium.
Right. Charlie.
So, since we started the discussion, originally I was going to say something like, oh, it's the input in the senses, like others said, but your quote, how we perceive with the brain rather than with the eyes, I'm actually more convinced of that now, where, if you hallucinate something, aren't you perceiving it from your own perspective?
By the way, give people a little background of the community that you're from and you kind of represent.
Well, I'm from, I guess, the Astral Codex 10 blog fan community. So it's a blog by a psychologist, and he talks a lot about perception and epistemology and just correct thinking and rationalism. So maybe that's related.
A little bit, yeah. All right, so I have a saying that I use a lot, and it's that what you see is what you get. Right? So if you measure an object in inches, you'll know the object in inches, but which types of observers or measuring calipers are other cognitive systems? So dogs and cats, squids, ants, maybe AI, right? So this thing is like, okay, you have a ruler. Now this is cut in inches or whatever, right? And if you measure an object that doesn't necessarily have some specific things that are defined about it, you're going to know that in inches. If you're only sensed into the world to say vision, you're only going to know this mouse in terms of vision. Right? And then we can talk into a whole other thing about how those different metrics can intersect. Right? What happens if you know an object through vision and smell and touch, and then how do they intersect into some bigger abstraction, right? But we're going to try to get into that a bit. Dogs use smell, olfaction, and taste, gustation, quite a bit, at least it seems. It's possible that if those are their preferred ways of interacting with their environment and communicating with other agents, right, perhaps it would be more efficient for them to directly model their world in terms of those common sensory modalities, right? This may also be the case for many humans, right? Perhaps the reason we tend to think in visuals, words, sounds, or certain representations of an idea, like even if you have aphantasia, it's because that's also the main way we communicate with conspecifics, so that would be other humans and stuff like that, right? We have similar, physiological limitations, right? So most humans may have an easier time inputting and outputting information that is visual or auditory based off of our physiological limitations, which is why it would be easier to directly think and model in that format, rather than having to make an entirely extra transformation between those, which may take more time and energy, right? So if you think about this, like usually we're inputting visual information and we can output our visual information like I'm literally doing right here, right? These are just lighted things on a pixelated screen. These are shapes. They only have meaning if you're trained on it, right? And you can kind of impose that kind of meaning onto it. And I think part of the reason that more humans will tend to think in terms of visuals and words and sounds or whatever is that, again, we can input it and output it, right? Now if you think of, say, a dog who, they have a pretty good sense of smell, it seems. And when they go and they piss on your lawn, they're usually marking their territory or doing whatever, and that's leaving a smell. And they're going to communicate with other animals or conspecifics about that. So they're inputting and outputting smell. Right? So they may actually, as they're taking their first little, paw walks into the world or whatever, they may be literally thinking and feeling things as a smell, which would be probably pretty foreign to most of us. Any questions, by the way?
Book, I thought my wife was a hack.
Yes, this is a pretty.
A person had a smell like a dog.
Right.
It was like 1,000 smells.
Yeah. Yeah, there is also a thing that happens when people are, in some kind of dreaming state, or again, advanced meditative state, psychedelic state, whatever, is that their sense of self will be like, I feel like I'm water. I feel like I'm this fractal, or I'm this color, or sound, or whatever, right? And they weren't technically trained on experiencing things that way, and yet there's still something that's happening that seems like they're having that experience. And again, we don't have a lot of data on this. Right, we don't have enough data. There's lots of self-experimentation, and people have been doing this for a long period of human history, but we just don't have enough of a framework that cohesively keeps all this under one umbrella yet. Hopefully we're getting closer. All right, thought experiment. Imagine you are an artist and you want to draw an apple on a white canvas. If you think of and represent that apple as a sound, emotion, or tactile sensation and try to draw it out on the canvas, it will take time and effort to convert that into what it should look like on the canvas, right? But if you directly think of the apple in the medium that you'd want to express it or communicate it in, right, there's much less work needed to make that conversion. There's more to it. Because distance from the end output representation that leads to degrees of freedom for interpretation and abstraction. If you want to make a highly abstract transformation, it may actually be better to think of the apple on the white canvas in terms of what you want to express it in or make the abstraction. So the example I would give is, okay, you're in your head, you're an artist. You want to put you have some very nice looking person you want to draw and make some money off of on a canvas, okay? Now, generally, it's going to be easier if you can picture that as it would look like on there. There's then just less of a translation you have to make. But now if the details are a bit more vague, or you're unable to pick up all the details from the actual thing in front of you, it takes a bit more time, processing time and effort, to go and translate that onto the white paper, right? Now, the other thing that's very funny to experiment with that I touched a bit on here is that what if you take that person or that apple or whatever, and now you're thinking of that through the lens of, say, smell, right? Olfaction. Or emotion. So musicians talk a lot about how they're not even necessarily thinking about the notes, they're thinking about the feelings and the emotions when they go and do this. I've known a lot of producers, in different genres of music that are like, I don't even really think of the notes, I just think of the feeling that I want, right? And then that kind of fills in the details for them. Also, different scientists have also spoken about similar things with numbers, right? But if you think of now this apple or this face in terms of a smell or something, you can now think of it more abstractly because it's gone such a distance from the actual thing. So it's like you have a Lego or something, and now you've removed all the pieces, and now you can rearrange it and do whatever you want. Because if I have a Lego set here, if I want to rearrange those same exact identical pieces, I have to temporarily remove them, pick up the bricks from the studs, and then go and reorder it. But you have to have that period, which we would say is abstraction, when you're temporarily removing those pieces, putting in that distance so then you can rearrange things. And so something that I would do is that, okay, I'm trying to draw something. If I can't think of this, in the way that I want to express it, and I start thinking of it in a more abstract way, I can make these much more kind of crazy transformations of things, right? I can have a face that feels like a smell or whatever, and then I can, just by interfacing with the smell, make more dramatic changes and then translate that over to the visual so that when I draw it, it now looks like a Picasso or something. Right, so I'm curious if anybody has kind of experimented doing this as an artist, a mathematician, engineer, builder, anything, if anyone's had experience with this before.
I am non-visual, so I didn't know people weren't until now. Brad Pitt.
Right.
Really famous. But that's why memory things are difficult for me, because I can't. Yeah. And so, but I know what a chair looks like. But I couldn't tell.
Well, what's very interesting about this is how an octopus's eye functions. And so unlike our eye, they have a very nimble and agile ability to move their pupil. Mm-hmm. So you'll see different pupil shapes. So one of the things that they're able to do is, by having unfocused eye capacity, they actually instantaneously camouflage with whatever they come near. So if you ever wonder about why it is that they can do that, they don't even actually have color perception in their eyes. It's in their skin. And so what we've discovered is that when you do sonic blasts, or when there's oil drills pumping out there, you'll see the octopus, and the way octopus are caught is in a jar. It's a Japanese jar with no lid. They crawl in there to protect their head. And you'll see them walking with coconut shells on their heads, on the ground.
So that's why they do it.
And that's why they do that, because what we've discovered is that it's very interesting too, because you've got a squishy brain and a squishy body that's really fully adaptive. The only thing that's really hard shell is their beak, but they can rapidly adapt, and they can be concussed by vibrations through the eye. And that's what they do to protect themselves so that they don't get that concussion. Because we see it in the measuring. When they start getting concussed, they start losing the ability to camouflage. They're confused. That's why I think this is really apropos, because what you're describing is giving space for the abstraction. Because when I saw this right away, I thought, okay, was Salvador Dali on drugs when he painted the clock?
Some people are just naturally high. Some people are just naturally high. I think I'm like that sometimes, but there's some people that are like, you're like born with like some high THC or DMT level. Like you're very non-neurotypical. There's many people like this. Yes.
You know, I try to understand that paragraph. Well, I'll do it quick, but it seems to me that what saying here is understood in the context of the adverb direct. So, because at first you say it takes more effort if you try to represent the apple in sound, emotion, and then at the end you say it actually may be less work. So you're trying to say that. So at first you say it's more work, and then you say it's less work. So you're saying so if I understand what you're saying is that instead of representing it, you think of that thing directly to the So directly is the thing.
Yeah. If I want to talk to you in English, for instance, I'm going to have an easier and quicker time if I think in English. Right now, if I'm thinking in Spanish or Mandarin or something, and then I want to make the translation over, it's going to take a little bit more effort and a little bit more time.
So instead of representing it as a sound or emotion, I think of it directly through the emotion.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
And then you see what manifests.
But then, you want to risk that might not be enough.
Well, this is the thing about, you have to be able to, if you think about, do you, even if you look at the apple in front of you, do you know the entirety of the apple? You're seeing what you're seeing on the outside. You have other things that can help you kind of guess, this is kind of the flesh inside the apple and the seeds and the stems or whatever, but you're not actually directly experiencing that. You're only interfacing with, say, the surface when you touch it or look at it, right? Now, if you have some crazy X-ray vision, maybe you could see a bit deeper, but again, these are the things about, we have limited sensory modalities, and yet we're still able to understand bigger pictures, right? So like even if you think about your hand, when I'm first going into the world and I'm looking at my hand, I'm like, oh, there's this thing. And it's only until I transform it and I rotate it and then I stitch those images together where I say, oh, this is actually one whole thing, right? If I have, this mouse or whatever and I see it for the first time, if I'm only seeing one angle of this, if I'm learning how to see things for the first time, I'm only seeing this slice of it. It's only until I'm able to stitch something towards this whole thing, at least on the outside, that I...
But that relate to what you're saying. So I was expecting you to say, actually, it's when you start experiencing the hand and you grab things with it, then you get, another...
But you can also move a hand without having to directly experience the hand. So this is a whole thing we can get about in cybernetics and stuff, and maybe we can do that later on in the presentation. So hold on to that question because it may be partially answered. Okay, all right, another thought experiment. Actually, this goes forward. Thought experiment. Let's say you need to cook a delicious Michelin star-worthy dish, but you have no taste or mouth. Having a good sense of taste and texture with your mouth would make this pretty easy, but there's an added limitation that now forms a different kind of observer. Assuming the same goal remains, you'll now have to interface using a different sensory modality, maybe audition, which is your hearing. Using only your hearing, how can you still construct an equally delicious Michelin star-worthy dish for your customer and communicate the instructions for this to another chef with or without your observer limitation? So if you want to take a second to think about this, if you have a response before I would give my response, but I already know what I want to say because I wrote this.
Do you have sight or only audition?
This would only be audition.
Okay.
So hearing.
But even with sight, that would be impossible, okay?
I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible because there's a couple things that you'll have to do. You have to figure out, on one hand, you could say you have somebody that does have a mouth and a tongue and everything, and they can communicate taste to you with English language. Like let's just say I have a really bad sense of taste, my tongue is numb or something, and I need to know, is this thing good or bad for me?
Point I see here is
Yeah.
that, yes, you would be able to come up with something with your audible senses, but it will be limited to our audible senses.
Yeah.
Maybe it would add to talking the language of food another flavor to it, or maybe another dimension, another, you know what I'm saying? But you would never be able to express the taste, the smell.
The end goal is that this is supposed to taste good to somebody else who has taste. And you, as the cook, has the limitation of you can only hear, or say vision or whatever, right? Now let's say I have no sense of taste or cooking ability, and someone feeds me instructions and I can just mix these things, do this thing, whatever. I don't have to know what's actually happening, right? If someone tells me, all right, make these really good cookies, make this whatever, I mix these things, do whatever, I don't actually know what's happening. I'm just following these instructions, right? That's the interface that you have. Right. No, but that's what we're using the language for. This person in particular, right? On one hand, you could say, all right, let's say this guy who doesn't have, you know, his sense of taste and texture in his mouth or whatever. How is he going to make this dish? All right, so could someone just feed him the instructions auditorily to do this, and he like maybe tap some things, make some noises to figure out, oh, this texture sounds like this, or if this thing is boiled, it sounds a little softer. There's many different ways you could try it, right? But the interesting thing.
I see what you do.
Yeah.
What you drive.
Yeah.
But listen. Now you're not talking about audible at all. You're talking about instruction.
Yeah.
Whatever they have, audible, whatever. So you have to understand that. Yeah, I see where you're leading at, which is good. But understand that you're not talking about any audible experience here. You're talking about instruction through an audible experience.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So the main thing here is the instruction.
Well, I was gonna say, you can create an LLM on just a bunch of text, like from humans, and just from that text alone, you can get an understanding of like how we would describe like the world around us in terms of like sight and like visuals and stuff like that. And you could ask it to describe a rose or something it's never really like seen before, maybe like just like something else in general. So I'm thinking that it's a bit related to what you're going for here.
Presentation.
That's a fantastic point, because ChatGPT has no sense of taste, but it can still write you a great recipe.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to make a point later on about this. All right, language is coordination. So hold on, let's skip this. All right, so what you see is what you get. Also applies to the concept of language and coordination itself. The pressures and limitations that create the observer, so observation in general, also creates the kind of language or coordination system that allows communication between observers or perceivers. Let's say you were going to rerun the evolution of life on Earth. You may eventually land on something human-like, or maybe even identical humans, the way we are today. But would English form in this exact same way? Right? What about other languages, right? So something to think about. Is the language and the concept that we have a language and instructions and all these things are because of the kinds of observers that we are. We can make the noises that we can make partially because of how our body is formed and the sort of spatial restrictions of it, right? And we have different kinds of eyes. We have people with different organisms with different hearing abilities, olfactory abilities, all these types of things, right? And so they may be experiencing abstractions themselves in an entirely different way, right? Because of those things. They're just seeing things differently than we would, and we're kind of trapped in this box of our, limitations because of our human body. And this actually kind of goes into that thing about, when I have a Lego set. Right? Now, the person who created and designed the set is putting in these instructions, this kind of coordination system, in a language that I can understand. Right? Now, I don't have to know how exactly they built the Lego set to build the Lego set. I can literally just kind of follow. It's the LLM thing, right? About taste and all that stuff, right? And I can still do it. I can build a thing, I can move it around, I can do whatever, but I'm not going to have the same understanding and experience as they did when they were designing it. Right? And then another thing is, how efficient is it to actually put in all the time and effort you did in the designing thing and put that so somebody else gets it? Most of the time, if you're buying a Lego set, you're just going to build it, whatever, put it up on a shelf, collects dust, waste money, whatever. I like Lego though, so not a waste of money.
I see where you lead that, because I know the context of the topic as language. So you're focusing on language, but there are two things happening in language. When you're reading that thing and you're reading it fast, I'm not picking up what it's saying. Because I don't know the context. It's giving me some time to experience it.
Right.
Now, a computer has algorithm and all this math stuff, whatever, and they can process it without understanding.
I like the way you said that. I like the way you said
super intelligence and computers being smart, whatever, that's crap. Okay? They're just super calculators. Okay? And you know, myself I have to experience. And the way I experience myriad of information from my body, from my biology, from my experience. Too much for a computer.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, back to your point
so
about
there are two experiences here.
Yeah. If you had a group of humans who only had taste and smell as their way of interacting with each other and the world around them, note these limitations. What type of coordination system would be utilized? The same idea is also very applicable to agency and cognition at all scales, from planets to cells to chemicals. More on this in the future. But yes, the big picture idea is that by expanding the doors of perception, we can open ourselves up to entirely new ways of experiencing reality and the things we tend to hold as pretty concrete. Thought experiment. This you don't have to answer this now because this could go on forever. But what is the minimum amount of actual observation or perception needed to generate something substantial or meaningful? Think about that for a little bit and let that marinate. Generating altered states with weird languages. Now we're getting into the fun stuff. Okay, I was interested in being able to think of and perceive information in entirely different ways in order to escape from my limitations as a specific kind of observer that I am. In a sense, pun intended, I wanted to be able to induce altered states of consciousness or cognition, whatever that means, without having to take a typical substance or go to sleep and enter a dream. In dreams or psychedelic states, if you haven't already experienced something similar, you'll find many stories of people describing their sense of self or attentional field or whatever, or some idea or feeling as literally being water or color or time or fractals or this or that or XYZ, whatever. It can get crazy. Right? Now, one of the ways I thought of getting this effect was with an olfactory language, so that's a smell language, a language that uses smell rather than visual, auditory, or tactile information. I started off by using liquid scents, right, so that you can get from, perfumes, colognes, whatever, shout out Dr. Han, to make shapes like letters on pieces of paper in a grid-like fashion. I would smell read these left to right. I'm not doing any, I'm smell reading, not snorting. Read these left to right and actively associate each smell with another smell or another idea, word, visual, whatever. Just like you're learning a new language. But eventually, these perceptual associations start to stick, and you can start rereading past ideas and memories under a new interpretation, sort of like you would when you update your past concepts and beliefs when you learn something new, right? Now, with this new perceptual lens, you can also reread and view your sense of self, the feeling of you as an observer, quite differently. Now, the first time this happened, it was really weird and felt pretty disassociative. I still don't know if I fully recovered from that all those years later, but it lined up with what I felt in dreams and later on felt during psychedelic experiences. So maybe it is possible to trip balls by learning a language differently. Now I will say that this was basically before I kind of really knew more about psychedelics and actually tried one. Now, in retrospect, I think this was the first kind of psychedelic experience I had, because when I had tried psychedelics afterwards and more intensive meditative practices, there was kind of a similarity there, right? But anyways, you are literally feeling and qualitatively experiencing these things as smells. It's very hard to describe if you haven't experienced something like this before. For that, we might need a different kind of language, one that I will elaborate on during a later post. That's a whole nother thing. I also noticed pretty quickly that I had a better sense of smell and could differentiate smells with finer detail, but that wasn't nearly as exciting for me as all this other stuff. So can you make a language out of anything? Yes or no? Quick. Yes?
Has to be something within our processing capability.
And I would be very broad. Yeah, pretty much. Maybe some limitations.
Yes,
Maybe.
In the case of this thing, the bots that were talking to each other in a language that people didn't recognize, something like that. But I want you to realize that there wasn't any psychedelic experience here with the smell. It was suggestive on your mind.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? So we're talking about two different things here. There is a time where the smell has a psychedelic effect on you, but then in that case, we're talking about here, you were associating the smells. So there was a suggestion from your mind.
Right. Yeah, these are these kind of internal things that are happening. And what I'm trying to say is that for most of us right now, the way we feel things and experiencing inside is just a way of feeling and experiencing things. And there are other ways to do this, right? And they can be beneficial for their own way. So I'm actually going to be expanding on this now about some weirder stuff. All right, so olfactory lang is not the main point of this post. It's more about looking differently at perception and observation and language as a whole. If any of this has some heft to it, we could study the mind and grow it in some pretty cool ways. Always exploring, so maybe this is entirely wrong. Maybe you'll disprove everything that I'm saying. But it does seem that you can essentially kind of make a language out of anything. Quotes, depending on what your purpose is. I've done this in many different ways, which you'll kind of see sneak peek stuff. Okay, a language that changes time perception. This is based on our subjective perception of time and how you can use the quality of that time perception itself to communicate, kind of similar to, say, what happened in the movies like Tenet or Arrival. So a little expansion on this, because I didn't expand on this in the post, so I'm going to give more information for the recording and presentation here. At the qualia thing we did the other day, when I was saying, you can go on your phone, you can set a timer. Yeah. And there's a feeling that's associated with 5 seconds. You're not actually sitting and counting to 5 or 10. There's a feeling associated with it. Now, if you build up strong enough of an association with that, could you start to feel that in other things? Yeah. Right? And can you start to be like, okay, I now know how my sense of time changes throughout the day. Like, I know if I'm feeling tired, how this changes, or if I'm feeling hyped up on caffeine or Adderall, how that feels. I know it looks like I'm hyped up on Adderall, but I'm not. I'm just naturally like this. And if you build strong enough of an association with that in your head, right, it's an experiential thing, it seems at least that you may be able to actually induce that. And again, this is also a thing I've heard of in, say, martial arts fighters. A language that induces and uses dreams to communicate. This one's interesting. All right, so this is probably even more weird. A few things I tried with this. The more interesting experiment was that if you have awareness during your dreams, and you associate enough of a symbol or language with that state, you can induce that dream state even when you're awake. Now let me rephrase this. You can induce aspects, you can select for certain things when you're in a dream state, in sort of a more so-called flexible state of mind, when you're sober. I actually think part of the quality and the feeling of abstracting and thinking that way is similar to what happens in dreams, right? So this has been incredibly useful for thinking abstractly and flexibly about really complex ideas. I actually think the quality of abstracting things in a sober state is already borrowed from what happens in dreams and relates to what it actually feels like for an observer to have more neuroplasticity and less perceptual rigidity. Charlie, I think you were there for this at the Polymath or the Mindfest dinner, but I was talking about what does it actually feel like to have more neuroplasticity. All right, so now, actually I think you might have been there. Actually, you guys were both there for that. There's this big talk about neuroplasticity. You're supposed to learn better, do all these things, whatever. Okay, what does that mean? We're talking about all these things that are happening in the brain when we look at it from the tools that we have, but what does that actually feel like? Right? I think part of when you experience more neuroplasticity, things have a bit more of an ambiguity to them. Not like a confusion ambiguity, but an ambiguity that, okay, this mouse doesn't have to only be used as a mouse. This pencil doesn't only have to be used for a pencil, right? This screen could be used for multiple different things. I think part of the reason that we tend to attribute, things like neuroplasticity, divergence, creativity, whatever, and younger people or people that are very cognizant of their minds, if they experiment with them a lot, is that they're experiencing things with a bit more vagueness. Right now, if you think about what happens with a lot of designers, which I also have partially a designing and arts background, is that a lot of the time you're trying to repurpose the tools that you have and the things that you have in front of you. So when I actually did a presentation about this at Cambridge Innovation Center last summer, I want to say, in Boston. And I was with Dan Elton, who was also here for Polymath Medical. Shout out Dan Elton. I was talking about, you have the idea of like a branch on a tree. A branch in your hand, branch on the ground, branch in a pit of fire. The branch is technically the same, but the context that's changing the way it's being used and experienced by another observer is sort of disrupting the whole thing, right? And so, something that's kind of interesting is that I think people with more neuroplasticity, they can tend to see more ways of using the same object, right? So that's, again, something for another presentation we can get into. Yes?
That language is very closely related to context. And language has to have some logic that reflects the context. Now, if the logic is skewed and not reflecting the context,
right,
you are, how would I say that? You are dreaming of the meaning.
Sure.
So the meaning is not really relevant.
Right.
It's not really relevant of the language that you are associating with the context. So
yes.
That's key, because there is a danger here that what you might call language might just be a dream without and inherent clarity.
I like what you're saying. I really like what you're saying, yes. I'm now getting a better picture of what you're getting at, yes. All right, here's an analogy I've used before that went well with others. Okay, I gave this earlier, but I'll say it again. You have some Lego bricks attached in configuration A. How do you transform those exact same pieces into a different structure or build? You remove or abstract those bricks away temporarily, right, and then attach those pieces in different places to form configuration B, right? So again, when I was saying earlier, you have a Lego set, could be large or small, right? It's built a certain way per these constraints, and now in order to rearrange that, you have to literally detach these things temporarily, and then you have the space to go and rearrange, put this in this area, whatever, right? The bricks haven't changed, but their orientation or interpretation has. All you needed was to temporarily remove these constraints so you can make a new configuration. Probably what we do with abstract thought and perception. So, just like what I was saying earlier, right? To induce state ambiguity is when you temporarily remove those pieces, and those pieces are acting like constraints in context. All right, and then that's sort of the end of that. You can see some of the things that I'm interested in. There's this handsome young lad right there. You can scan these QR codes for Twitter, /X, Insta, YouTube, Substack, the Ekkolapto website. We'll see all the stuff that we do. We recently worked on the Polymathematical Salon here at the Sandbox with Ruben, Alon, William. We had Michael Levin from Tufts be the keynote presenter. We had Gil Blander from Insight Tracker, Dan Elton. We had a bunch of people we invited from Boston to come. And so some of the things that I'm working on, so unconventional languages, improvisation. Some of you were there at Mindfest. Do you guys remember Jonathan, the freestyle rapper? Yes. He just performed at the Apollo. So mental simulation capabilities. So this is saying simulation in terms of not just vision, vision information, but also smell, all these other things. Sleep and deep awareness, talked about that. Healthily sleeping for less. This is a very interesting one. This one, I can only say the limited experiments that I've done because it's just been very difficult to tackle in general. But I think there could be some ways. So usually if you're sleeping for less, that means you're not getting good quality sleep and you're not going to perform well. Now there are people that can, yes, healthily sleeping for less.
Is that
so
less time?
Yeah, so they can sleep for less time and they're healthier. They're just as healthy as if they got a full night's rest, but they can sleep for 4 or 3 hours. Now there are people that seem to be biologically like this from the start.
And how do you define health?
Huh?
How do you define health?
Well, that's also something to get into because we don't actually know what these things mean. So these are incredible questions.
They might be able to perform well in some time,
right,
and maybe not.
Oh yeah, totally. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. There's things that could seem like they're really good for us now, but only until later down the line we realize, oh shit, that's not good.
What does the Ekkolapto mean?
If I got Google Translate correctly, that means Greek for incubate.
Greek for?
Incubate. Like incubating ideas or new things, yeah. And then savant syndrome and synesthesia. So savant syndrome is something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm kind of sad that there's not a lot of people looking at it anymore because these are people that have some pretty insane capabilities. Like there's people that can calculate pretty large sums of numbers. They have very, very incredible memories, and there's, huh?
Calendar
Yeah.
function.
Yeah. Well, here's the crazy thing. There's people that can be born like this who are either neurotypical or they have some form of autism. But there's also people that started off neurotypical and they get knocked in the head a certain way, and then they awake with these types of savant syndrome capabilities. That's called acquired savant syndrome.
What about there are no people who develop it by sheer practice?
That's something I want to get. That's something I want to work on. I like where you're going.
What's synesthesia?
Synesthesia is actually sort of the stuff I was talking about earlier about. So people will feel, a color will be a number to them, a sound will have a taste to them. It's a mixing of your sensory modalities. So I actually have another presentation I gave before. This was also in Boston about how language and synesthesia are kind of the same thing because they're just associations with each other to create that abstract. Yeah, no, it's fine. Go for it.
There is something, I don't think I have ever experienced that.
Yeah.
In dreams. I have some weird dreams.
Yeah.
Like articulate dreams. That's
Yeah.
And they get in my nerve because they are so articulate
Right.
that they get me thinking.
Yeah.
Sometimes negative, sometimes positive. But anyway, the idea of experience, I've never experienced myself being water or anything else.
Interesting.
I've always been a person that I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, no, I'm glad you bring that up because the more we kind of look into dreams, we see there are these kinds of invariances, but there are a lot of variances. There are also some people that just don't dream. So the other one is neurological vision enhancement. Now there's a couple people here that have gotten kind of, they've heard about this before, but this is something I'm going to be working on and potentially launching publicly next year, about ways of enhancing vision by stimulating the brain rather than touching the eyes. Because if you go to a lot of scientists and you say, all right, well, do you see with your eyes or with your brain? They'll say, yeah, your eyes are taking in light, whatever, but it's the brain that actually technically does the seeing. And if that's really the case, then why are our interventions towards, fixing vision issues sometimes very invasively touching the eye, but they're not doing anything to the brain? So time perception, I spoke a little bit about the time perception thing earlier. Longevity, so a lot of this is also about how can you, I say kind of the focus of Ekkolapto and everything that we're trying to do is how do you enhance the, capabilities of the brain and the body to better understand reality. So it's like philosophy technology in a sense. And then working memory and intelligence also kind of goes hand in hand with this. I think we need to have a sort of an updated version of what we think of as information or intelligence and all these types of things. And one of the thought experiments I actually want to leave everyone with relates to intelligence and stuff like that. So the idea was, let's say you have two people, right? They each say they have an IQ of just 100, the average whatever IQ. I know the IQ scale has its own ways of doing things, but for sake of argument, 200 IQ people, right? How can they communicate with each other and coordinate as agents and minds to solve a problem that would be for a 200 IQ person, right? Now, if you go right now and you put two people that even have 130 IQ together, two of them, and solve a task, they still may not be able to do it, right? Because you say, oh, there's a synergistic thing and they work together, but there can also be interference, right? There's also the idea about too many cooks spoils the dish. So this is I think a very, very fun question to think about.
But this is clear that you don't add these things. That is well known in the literature in management,
Right.
in team learning.
But is there a way that you can do it?
Do what?
Where you can have a synergy?
You're talking about is adding the IQs.
Yeah.
It never works.
Yeah. But is there a way to do it?
Additive capability.
Yeah. The whole point of when you have a team is someone has this strength and weakness, they have their strength and weakness, but they're together, they make up for their losses. Right?
Yeah, but they'll be limited not by the IQ, but by the number of people.
Right. I'm focusing on IQ as a trait because it's kind of elusive.
I wonder, all these things that you're doing, how does that translate into your own intelligence, into your own awareness of your intelligence? Do you feel like that has expanded your horizon?
The short answer is yes. But the long answer and the more truthful answer is that I don't know. Because the thing that's strange, right, and the thing that complicates this is there's interference effects. So there's things where if I've got locked into a certain practice for a while, right? So actually one of the things, it's not on this presentation, can learning an olfactory language potentially dampen the effects of other ways you're thinking in your mind? Right? So there's a thing about if you are specializing in these different traits, maybe you want to practice all of them so that one is not taking over for the other. Right? And then you can ask, oh, is there something I can train on that generalizes to all those things? Right? There are you can go on forever and ask questions, but I would say so. It feels like it. It feels like it. Maybe people here would say differently, but I can definitely say it. Well, actually, when I've tried to sort of focus specifically on IQ things, I've spoken to a couple of people here about this before, but. The way those changes happen, so there's something I'm calling it like an afterglow effect. Like I'll do some training thing, whether it's an olfactory thing or some working memory or visualization thing or whatever. And there's a period where it could be anywhere from a couple of minutes to a couple of hours. And that task now becomes very easy, even though I trained on it for a little bit. And then it dissipates and goes away, it's temporary. And then sometimes when you learn the skill, if you don't do it in some certain way, you actually lose it. Like there's been times I've worked at this thing, I've done this, and then I'm like, I've been putting in all this time, I thought this was supposed to work, and now it's gone. So,
stop.
No, I was still practicing it, and the skill just wasn't sticking. Okay. This has happened a lot.
Have you seen with the Max Planck Institute in Jupiter, where they take the blind mice, the mice have never been exposed to light, and then they put them on a ball, and then they open their field of vision. And the interesting thing is, they think, oh, there's going to be something instantaneously happening. It normally has this delayed period where all these, then we're in Michael Levin's world, these proteins start to activate in these cell membranes to then create this massive growth in the brain around that neural optical system that integrates with pathway finding.
Yeah.
But it has to be something that they value. So
Yeah.
if they're trying to work through a maze, they're actually working through a virtual maze.
So you say that sometimes it works and sometimes out for no reason it doesn't. But there are always some changes that you haven't considered. It's the same thing that happened in that thing that is a Sachs movie where the people were started doing well, the pathological, mentally pathological people, and then for no reason after a while they just stop. But there are maybe some conditions you haven't considered.
Yeah.
Thinking about your point with ambiguity and neuroplasticity, that's excellent in regards to understanding the space that kind of has to be there. But what about dissonance? What about how does that factor into it? You know, that sense of, oh, I'm confused. Or,
But dissonance is a context, right?
Sure. Yeah, like dissonance.
Right.
There's always a context.
Yeah, you know you're confused if you had a reference point that you no longer have, type of thing. And you know, I do think that ambiguity is a kind of controlled kind of confusion. Like it's like a meta thing that you know that you're confused, but you still have recollection of what the original state was.
Yeah, a gradient. Variance.
Yeah. You should look into, there's this organization called the Qualia Research Institute. I believe they're Qualia Research Institute. It's just QRI.org. I've been wanting to go into their work a lot more, but everything I've seen so far has been very impressive. And this is the thing, like we just don't have enough information about this stuff. We don't know enough, right? But from what I can say from my kind of probes into this, is that if you learn a skill too actively, you have to get back into the active state to have that skill. So there's a thing where people say, oh, like when they learn a language to pick it up naturally over time or whatever. A lot of times with that, I think when you do that, is you're learning it kind of below the surface, whatever that means, and that will just kind of pop up into your head. Like one thing that I noticed with like all these unconventional language things is that if I had to like purposely picture these things in my mind, do this, if I wanted it to just kind of automatically show up with less effort, it wouldn't do that at times. Right? I'd have to actually learn it a little bit more slower and like throughout the day rather than in one sitting. I need to think of the right way to explain this because the irony of language, right?
It's an experiential thing. Because when you do it fast, you have less experience. It's less deep.
Yeah.
You know?
So probably an absorption rate.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The thing that I'd noticed when I was doing this is that, you know, I'm going and doing this thing. If I'm actively thinking about all of the things, it was much harder to do something. I had to sort of forget about it and let the details fill themselves in. I don't even know if I'm explaining that right.
That's very,
right?
very deep. That's very that's the idea of thinking fast and slow.
Yeah.
Because when you're doing slow thinking, you control the variables. But when you're doing fast thinking, you don't control the variables.
Yeah.
They are automatic. And life is about fast thinking because so many things come at you, so many things you have to process. And once you start slowing things, you stop the process. Improvisation,
which I also wrote as the second thing, is actually also very interesting about this because when I've tried to improvise, whether it's with lyrics or with instruments or whatever, is that I would notice that like especially if you're trying to do a rap or a rhyming thing or whatever, what would happen is you're selecting for the sound that you're trying to rhyme for, right? Bounce, ounce, pounce, whatever, right? And you have to keep that in mind as you're letting the other words flow in, but if you focus too much on that, it interferes to letting all the other words come in. So there's this very delicate kind of balance about keeping one thing in your focus, but then not interfering with other things. Again, it's such an experiential thing that I have a hard time getting that point across unless you try it.
Well, there's a level of mastery too.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking in tennis, for example, you've got a high ball coming in, and you want to hit it somewhere.
Yeah.
They focus there, but they also focus on where their opponent is. So they split their focus. That's a mastery.
Yeah. Now, what I will say though, if you want a shorter, better packaged answer for how to get over that learning curve kind of issue, is that if you're doing some type of skill, try to generalize it to something else. So let's say you're trying to learn drums or something, and you're kind of hitting a roadblock, go to another instrument and then come back. You have to step away from it slightly so that I guess your mind can kind of contextualize it or something and come back. It's like tunnel vision.
It's experience.
Right? There's a lot of times, I'm sure many of us have probably experienced this, where we're focused on some problem and we're like, damn it, I can't figure this thing out. You walk away, do whatever, and like, oh man, that answer was clear as day. Why didn't I think of that before?
That's because of hippocampal ripples.
There you go. He's going to come up with something special at the end of this.
So when you're, so I'm getting a PhD in neuroscience right now. But when your brain isn't engaged with the skill you're learning, there's these things called hippocampal ripples, or even when you're just sitting there daydreaming or meditating or sleeping. And so when you're learning something, what's happening in your brain is that you're getting a certain kind of circuit reinforced, and that's what you're learning. And hippocampal ripples are a sort of process that happens when you stepped away from the thing, and they reinforce that circuit at like 3 times the speed that it gets reinforced.
That's interesting to hear that from a biological perspective, but it's well known in the psychological literature, in organizational learning and stuff like that. It's once you take a break.
That's how they actually know about them, is because the hurts are different from everything else in the brain. And neuroscientists were like, what on earth is going on in the hippocampus? And people are just sitting here and daydreaming. Why is there all this activity? And it turns out that's the reason why.
Yeah, once you take a break from something, you get to see things from
It's the context. Right. Yes.
More experience.
Hippocampus and
then there's nothing like time.
glandular.
10,000 hours. That's why.
Now something interesting though, right? Because a lot of what we're trying to do is we're trying to shorten that learning period. Right, is I think something that happens to increase that ability is that one of the ways you could try to do this is changing your time perception, right? Is that if you can, let's just say you slow things down, right? And then instead of experiencing that over, a couple of days, you experience that in say a couple of minutes or hours. If you can change your time, and actually one way to maybe look at this is how other animals that may perceive time slower or faster, how they would go about learning things like this.
You're kind of pushing things, and maybe it's possible, but then we return to the issue we're talking about. You put yourself in a game context.
Yeah.
Where things are very intense. But I wonder if the learning will last. The same issue with the context of game. And then to talk about this military training. We know the adverse effects. They have adverse effects because they have been concentrated. They have been.
You can overtrain on the simulation.
You can what?
I don't think you should overtrain on the simulation because that's not completely representative of the whole thing.
Yeah.
You're trying to get some kind of transfer, but there might be limitations to this.
That would be the same thing.
Yeah.
Same apply.
Well, yeah. I don't know. This could be all wrong. I don't know. These are just experiments and ideas, and it's up to people like the people here and whoever will see this online to contribute more or disprove things or whatever. I mean, what I'm very passionate about though is that I do think the idea that I am pretty attached to, I can always change it if I need to, but attached to for the given moment, is that I think there's a lot of things we can do with unconventional approaches, right? I think a lot of times when we get locked into a certain way of doing things, we're like, we confuse our paths and our goals, right? I want to get to this side of the room. There's not only one way of doing that, right? Could I move the tables and the thing to get there? Could I go around it? Could I dig something? There's all these, could I jump and hop over this? Could I fly? Whatever, there's all these different things.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I understand you so well.
Thank you.
It's even more intriguing and more interesting to find out how things really work.
Yes.
So you can use it.
I agree.
More natural. The same way we were talking about all these things that affect your intelligence, your level of fatigue.
Yeah.
And then the natural way is to go to bed early and sleep enough time. And a lot of people have become distracted. They don't realize what they're doing.
Yeah.
They get tired just because they're not focusing on the discipline.
Yeah.
So it's two different approaches, but maybe complementary.
Right.
One way you try to push things the way you say, and another way understanding really how things work so you can apply in real life in a natural way.
I love thinking very deeply about things and creating these kinds of theories and frameworks and everything. At the end of the day, I think you can also kind of prove those things and test those things by trying to build something and do something more practical and tangible. Bring it into the so-called real world. And I love abstracting and theorizing and speculating and figuring out why these things are, what's the greater purpose of these things. I mean, whenever I do have a thought, I'm like, why? And I'm like, oh, should I be asking why? And you get into these crazy cycles of doing these things. This very popular science and philosophy podcast is called Theories of Everything. He's actually come here multiple times. And so he has a... TOE, Kurt Mungle, yeah.
That's great stuff, man.
Yeah, he's great. He just put out a 3-hour-long iceberg video on physics theory, yeah. He's awesome. Well, actually, his QR code is right there. Kurtzai Mungol, there you go, yeah. And so, you know, he'll have people like Leonard Susskind talk about his theory of everything, which is kind of on the physics side. You'll have things like Michael Levin or Stephen Wolfram that will talk about theories of everything for more biological systems, whatever. But the other thing, though, if you say theory of everything, you kind of mean everything. That should mean physics and biology, cognition, all these things. Is there a framework that lets you tie all those things together? Yeah, like that's what I'm interested in.
That's string theory.
Yeah. Well, string, you know, I'm not a hater of string theory. My verdict, I'm not a physicist, my verdict is not out on string theory, but I do wonder if perhaps there's an interpretation problem with that, where they're meaning this in this way, but there could be another interpretation that they haven't thought of that could be useful for it, right? You know, it's sort of like how we brought, you know, ideas from mathematics and physics into the finances and economics. Apparently, this is what the famous Jim Simons had done at one point.
There's a lot of transfer of like ideas that they come up with in string theory to mathematics.
Yeah.
So that is a thing.
But have we seen what those ideas look like for modeling things in cognition and perception?
I don't think so.
It could be used. It could be useless, or it could be interesting. I don't know. We have to run the thing to find out.
String theory is very intriguing.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because we're actually perceiving something that doesn't exist within our framework.
What doesn't exist?
Dimensions beyond the 3 or 4 that we experience, and yet,
But the math's moving.
with the math, but we're using math as a language or a perceptual tool to define something that we absolutely cannot perceive with our physical senses.
Yeah, we cannot perceive where we come from.
So
Yeah. Well, no, that's a very good point.
we're seeing beyond, at least through theory, we're seeing beyond anything that we can actually perceive. Now, maybe generations from now, with different tools, we'll be able to see in other dimensions using advanced computational tools that we don't have right now.
I really actually like what you had just said. I also like what you said, but I like what you said, because at least the way that I was thinking of it is like, you know, we tend to focus on, oh, what happens after death? What happens before birth? Where do we come from?
Right.
Yeah, that's a question that relates to dimension.
Yeah.
Maybe scientists might say whatever they want.
But no, the point though about where, you know, we talk about, you know, what's after death or whatever, but what's before birth? I think they could be intrinsically tied, potentially, right? And I think the nice thing about sort of a philosophical approach, right? Because there's kind of the so-called, you know, pop philosophy, surface level of things, but then if you actually like really go into it and explore more, it starts to have a lot of connection to things in math and physics and cognition and biology and all these things. And I think to sort of have a good direction of things to explore and question is to kind of be like a philosopher in a lot of ways. I don't think it's a negative thing.
Yeah. You can go in circle ways and you can go crazy also.
Totally. Yes, we'll get back to that, but if anybody wanted to scan, this is kind of a special thanks to everyone that I've spoken with about these ideas too on the Polymath Salons, online or in person. We have DBZ, who's star right there. He'll be
over in the top left.
Yes.
Daniel,
the first thing right there.
Daniel
Van Zandt.
Wow, you have a name, man.
We got
Freebird.
I am a free.
Freebird. All right. We got Ethan from QRI. We've had lots of long discussions on working memory and intelligence. We have
about
Curiosate, so it's this guy. He has a lot of actually very similar ideas that he calls sensory weaving, about where you're taking these different senses and mixing them together to interpret things differently. So he actually contributes quite a lot to the salons that we do. We have Professor Lon Barinholtz, also co-founder of the lab here. Professor William Hahn, also co-founder of the lab, he was just here. Michael Ostroff, who's right there. Misha, who's not here but is always an extreme contributor. Kurtzai Mungol from Theories of Everything, I noted him. Tyler Goldstein, he runs another similar channel. It's called Theories of Everyone. He has his own theory called Sentient Singularity Theory. He actually might be presenting virtually, potentially next Saturday at the Sandbox, which you guys should totally come for. Luca Del Deo from Harvard, he works on things like tulpomancy, which is how to build up a separate kind of personality in your mind and interact with it. Apparently it's the thing that method actors and stuff like that, you know, that they'll do. Tulpomancy. Tulpamancy. Yes, I can expand more on that in a bit. We have the Ekkolapto scientific advisor, Daniel Elton, who's at the NIH, got his PhD in physics from Stony Brook. We have Jess Parent, also known as Jesse Parent, Dugan Hammock, who's also from the Wolfram Institute, and then Tomer Solomon, who studied mathematics. And he is a very fascinating, highly creative individual, and he's trying to figure out how to tie science and philosophy and ideas from human religion together into a unified framework. Because the kind of perspective is that at one point...
Religions?
All
human religions?
As far as I know, all human religions, right? Because the thing that's interesting about religion, right, is yeah, there are these negative connotations with it, but if you think about this, like that was part of our way of interacting and understanding the world for a long part of human history.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Explaining the inexplicable.
It's very possible that there could be some interesting ideas as it relates to, yeah.